historical truth of the medieval Crusades compared to the modern myths and legends that surround them? Join us today as we discuss that question with our guest, Dr. Paul Crawford, Professor of Medieval History at California University of Pennsylvania. I'm Michael Hernan, Vice President of Advancement at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio, and you're watching Franciscan University Presents. Stay with us. Welcome to Franciscan University Presents. Today we'll be talking about the Crusades. I'm your host, Michael Hernan, Vice President of Advancement here at Franciscan University. Joined here in our studios with our regular panelists, Dr. Regis Martin, Professor of Systematic Theology here at Franciscan University, Dr. Scott Hahn, who holds the Father Michael Scanlon Chair in Biblical Theology and the New Evangelization, and our special guest, Dr. Paul Crawford. You have an undergraduate from Peru State University, an MA, and a PhD in Medieval History from the University of Wisconsin, and you're currently a professor of history at the California University in Pennsylvania. Your specialty is the Crusades and the military religious orders, such as the Knights Templar and others. And you published a number of works on these subjects, so we're so glad you're with us here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so we're talking about the Crusades, and there's a lot that goes with that. But first, let's start. When we say the Crusades, what are we really referring to? Kind of just define Crusades for us.
Well, I think what most people are talking about when they think about the Crusades are the 8 major expeditions to the Holy Land from Western Europe, beginning in 1095 in the 11th century and running up through the end of the 13th century to 1270. That's not the only set of expeditions that qualify as Crusades. The English historian Jonathan Riley Smith has defined a crusade as basically an expedition in defense of Christianity called by the Pope and with strong penitential overtones, and that covers expeditions to the Holy Land, to Spain, to the Baltic, to southern France.
So much wider than what we might commonly
Very
think.
much wider.
Okay,
yes.
and the time frame was a large...
Was much larger. Really, the time frame for the Crusades should be thought of as running from the 11th century into the 17th.
Wow.
I would say that the last crusade probably was in 1683 with the relief of the Siege of Vienna.
Okay, so let's start with why were if they had a penitential component to it, there was obviously a military intervention and called for by the Pope. I think those were the, why were they waged?
Why were the Crusades waged? There's another English historian who's given a very nice, short, concise answer to that. The Crusades were the long-term result of the rise of Islam. Because they are defensive expeditions in response to Islamic invasion.
Yeah, so a reaction to a provocation.
Very much so.
You know?
Yeah. Yes.
But they've been given a very bad historical rap, right?
Yes, unfortunately.
And why is that?
There are complex reasons for that. A lot of it, I think, goes back to Western self-hatred, really. A rejection of what the Christian West stood for, and therefore a rejection of the Christian West's right to defend itself.
You know, perhaps some of your professors at Wisconsin upheld that view.
Right? I would say that it's complicated, though, by the fact that the Reformation really represents a line of demarcation. Because up until the Reformation in the 1500s, there really was a broad consensus among Christians that what was happening was entirely justifiable on moral grounds through the natural law and as biblical grounds, precisely because they're defensive wars. You know, at one point, Islam had basically taken 2/3 of Christendom.
That's right.
And so, you know, it was a slow reaction, but it was an understandable action. And I think Luther, because the Pope called for it, targeted that and said that this was really, you know, to extend the tyranny of the papacy. And that's when the questioning began. And then, of course, the Enlightenment represents an even more disruption, you know, a greater disruption.
Yes, very much so.
And so, today we've got from Luther and the Reformation, Enlightenment, all the way through to modern scholars and throughout, really casting aspersions and settling a lot of misinformation.
But you know, if you zero in on the middle of 1500s as a kind of flashpoint, or maybe the 1400s, the great primatial seas of Christendom have all been co-opted by Islam.
Except for one.
Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch,
Yes.
and then Constantinople.
Yes.
Yeah.
Only Rome
Yes,
stands.
only Rome. That's
And
right.
you would think that the impulse to rally round Rome would be almost irresistible.
Well, there was an impulse to do that, and even after the Reformation, that impulse, there was a kind of echo of that impulse in 1571 after the Battle of Lepanto, which was won by an allied fleet, Venetians, papal forces, Spanish forces, I think.
Yes.
The church bells in England, then Protestant England, were rung in celebration after Lepanto.
Wow.
but then that was
Our
followed by the
Lady's
Spanish
victory,
Armada.
yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
And
yes, it
even
was.
Luther changed his mind when Austria was being threatened
Yes.
by Muslims too.
Yes.
At that point, it's no longer Rome, and
Yes.
it's not the
Yes.
Pope. It's
Yeah,
getting
it's-
close
So
to
Don
It's good
Juan
old
of
Germans.
Austria was the great champion of
Yes,
Luther
yes.
in that particular naval battle.
The champion of the Catholic side.
Right,
Yes,
right,
very much
right.
was.
He secured
Yes.
a Christendom for the West.
It should be said that during the Middle Ages there were people that objected to the Crusades, not so much because they didn't think, well, not at all because they didn't think Christendom should be defended, but because they thought it was the wrong approach.
You know,
A tactic or
Yeah, it was the
strategy.
wrong tactic. The great Catalan thinker Ramon Llull, for
Yeah.
example, wavered back and forth between arguing in favor of crusades sometimes and in favor of missions activities at other times. And in the end of his life, he was 81, I think, he went himself to North Africa as a missionary saying, this is what we should do to combat Islam. And what happened was he got his skull staved
Right,
by
yeah.
stones. He
There's
got killed.
there's an interesting parallel when you consider the Dominicans. They were founded in order precisely to win back the Albigensians in southern France. But that particular crusade came to a crashing halt when these wonderful friars walk into these Albigensian villages to preach and to pray, and by example and exhortation win them back to Rome. They're simply ignored.
They're ignored, and therefore force had to be used.
Yeah, the
And
secular arm had
yes.
to step in.
the Albigensian Crusade is an interesting case study for crusading. The church gets criticized for having used force against the Albigensians, against the Cathars. But in fact, there was a canonical reason why they needed to do it and do it quickly. According to canon law, at least at the time, and I think now still, you're not considered a heretic if you are not the person who instigated the defective beliefs. And the people who had instigated the beliefs, that generation was about to die off. So the church was about to be in a position where it couldn't do anything about it if it didn't act quickly.
You know, you just made a point that I want to go back to for a moment, because, you know, there is a sense in which Christians who are sympathetic to the goals of the Crusades nevertheless can call into question the strategic value. You know, even prescinding from the morality, because I think that what shocked me the most in preparing for this show was just how clear and strong is the case for the Crusades. But practically, from a prudential standpoint, you know, only the first Crusades in the 11th century were a limited success. You know, most of the other ones that are typically called Crusades, and even that language is anachronistic, because the language wasn't even used by the Christians until really, I think, the 19th century.
It was used by the High Middle Ages, but not in the first century, probably.
Yeah.
Not in the
Not in the first Crusade.
11th and 12th. No, it wasn't.
Yeah, it became a term of opprobrium, you know. But I think this idea that missions, you know, what St. Francis of Assisi is doing in seeking to evangelize and seeking after martyrdom as well, you know, that I think is a real exemplary alternative. You know.
It was, but it wasn't very effective.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And he also preached the Crusades himself, and the Franciscans did.
But
too,
I
and
mean,
that's
this crusading spirit, I think, is exemplified in a diversity of ways. Francis represents one way. I think taking up arms on behalf of Christendom constitutes another equally legitimate way.
Yes, and the thing that's at the core of both of those impulses is Jesus' words, "Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." Francis and Ramon Llull were doing it in one way. When Francis went to talk to the Sultan on the Fifth Crusade, the Crusaders were doing it in another way, and they very much conceived of themselves as doing that. This is an important point, that they saw the Crusades as an act of love on behalf of other Christians.
And you make that point that it was an act of love, but help me, the modern mind and our sensibilities today, and also those who understand what the church is teaching in on just war and so forth. We say that there was a strong case for the Crusades, but this is the Pope calling for what some would call a religious war. You know, walk me through how this fits within Catholic teaching on just war.
It's rather easy, actually. just war theory, of course, is the theory that says that there are some wars that are not only just, but it would be unjust not to fight them. It draws on a tradition going back to Augustine, St. Ambrose. And St. Ambrose said something very interesting that has always stuck with me ever since I read it. And I'm going to paraphrase it, of course, but he said, if you see someone doing a wrong deed, you see someone using force on someone else, someone acting unjustly to someone else, and you have the means to stop it, and you don't, you're morally guilty of that act that has been carried out by the perpetrator. And that includes force. If you have the ability to stop an unjust act by force and you fail to do it, you're morally guilty of it. And I think that the Catechism of the Catholic Church says something much the same.
Yes.
There's a beautiful line in Romano Guardini where he says, I think quite prophetically, that at the end of the day, the sin of Cain and the sin of Pilate are morally indistinguishable. I mean, to kill your brother, that's murder. But not to intervene on behalf of your brother is equally murderous.
Let me shift this, though, because it's not just an individual responsibility to intervene when you see another individual perpetrating some kind of violence. I think even more so when you have been entrusted with the responsibility of, say, caring and protecting your family. You know, as a father of 6 and now a grandfather of 9, I have this sense, you know, certainly the shepherd lays down his life for his sheep, you know, but he doesn't lay the sheep down in their lives, you know, and even better than laying down your life would be laying down the lives of the wolves who are attacking the sheep.
Yes.
And not to not do so would be a serious dereliction of duty.
Very serious.
It would be an immoral sort of thing. This is why pacifism thrives on the basis of individualism, where we really step back and fail to see the kind of corporate relations that we have in the family, in the town or village, and in the state, but especially in the mystical body of Christ, where people we've never met are really and truly our brothers and sisters in Jesus because of baptism. And you know, for them, you know, I remember hearing when I was in Istanbul, Constantinople, about the sack of, about the conquest, and we had a Muslim guide who explained how merciful dimitude was. You know, that is the enslavement of Christians. You know, it's the payment of a tax. You know, and you're allowed to worship privately. You can't display anything publicly. You can't share the faith publicly, but you can do it all privately. And then the tax is raised to the point where Christian families simply can't afford it.
Function.
And he said, well, provisions were made, though. And out stepped these two, a couple from Malta, and said the provisions were the firstborn son. I mean, it was shades of Egypt. You forfeited your firstborn son if you couldn't pay the tax. And they didn't just take a few, they took a lot, and they trained them as Muslim militants.
Yeah, that's the foundation of Janissaries in Turkey.
And this Muslim guy did not view that as somehow reprehensible?
Well, once the Maltese couple stepped forward and spoke up, he was mum. You know, because they were rehearsing the history of the attack on Malta and how the first wave of Muslim militants were the children of the Christians who had been forfeited instead of the tax to be the warriors.
1565.
And I think I think that's a crucial point. So we have the Pope and the Church at the time calling out of an obligation, you know, an obligation to step in.
An obligation is right.
And they did it out of love. But distinguish a little bit deeper. Some of the you know, some people cast aspersions on the Christian activity versus the Muslim. Kind of differentiate the Muslim
jihad
versus what we would have in the Christian response.
Once again, it's pretty easy to do. Muslim jihad is a religious obligation for Muslims to extend the area that Muslim law is observed, the Dar al-Islam in Islamic terms. It doesn't have to be done by violence, but it certainly can be and very often is. So jihad is something that is aggressive and expansionistic. The Christian idea of crusading is exactly the opposite. It's defensive. Crusades were never ever supposed to conquer land that had never been Christian. It is designed to protect Christians who are either under attack or under the kind of dimitude, the kind of servitude that you're talking about, Scott. It's a completely different kind of thing. It's a defensive, reactive kind of activity that is, as we've been talking about, designed as an act of love to protect those who need to be protected. So kind of really the exact opposite. The two are very often equated as being the same kind of thing, but they're night and day, really.
Yeah, and I think that's the crucial thing, is that when the Crusades are brought up, it's like, oh, well, they all were in it equally, and they both have blood on their hands. But it's very, very different historical case, and that's what you're both making in your writing and your teaching are really showing that. Stay with us on Franciscan University Presents as we go into some of the myths behind the Crusades. Stay with us.
When I teach my classes on the medieval world and the history of Islam, and I talk about the Crusades, I make sure to mention to my students the positive fruits of the Crusades, one of which is the expansion of Europe, economically in particular. There was a huge economic upswing in the High Middle Ages. And there was also this evangelical awakening in the High Middle Ages with the interest in the Holy Land. There was more interest in reading and living the gospel, living the apostolic lifestyle. And many more people were much more interested in the imitation of Christ and living life in the imitation of Christ. So you see new religious orders founded, and even lay apostolic movements founded in the High Middle Ages.
I'm Dan McNally. I'm a theology major here at Franciscan University. I love studying theology, it's my passion, but I mean, I love learning too. You walk out of the classrooms, you want to know more, you don't want the lecture to end. So, I mean, that's the really great thing about being a part of a student body, is you can continue to discuss outside. It's not just studying to make a grade, it's learning to, you know, improve yourself, and not just through your own personal prayer or your own personal study, but through community, because that's what we're made for. Franciscan University is academically excellent and passionately Catholic.
People recognize Franciscan University as being academically excellent and passionately Catholic. We have the unique opportunity through our faculty members, through our students, to proclaim that academic excellence by reaching out in many different ways. We also remain passionately Catholic in the way in which we are able to worship, the way in which we are able to bring that love of Christ to others on a daily basis. It's important for us to be able to embrace both.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. Today we're talking about the Crusades. This is something that people do get hit at as Catholics oftentimes. It's seen in popular films like The Kingdom of Heaven with a lot of historical inaccuracies. Even a former president, Bill Clinton, talked about some things that were historically inaccurate. Yes. I was going to say problematic, but I think they're really inaccurate. Yeah. So the quote that we hear, we've already dealt with kind of the myth, were the Crusades an aggression of the Catholic Church, and we've already seen that really is debunked, because the reality is it was a defensive maneuver, and it was the Muslims who first attacked.
Yes.
So when the Crusades captured Jerusalem in 1099, did the blood really run ankle deep in the streets, which is an exact quote? Was it an accurate tale of the massacres perpetrated by Christians? Because again, a former president even used that exact quote.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. The short answer is no. There's a longer answer. The short answer is do the physics. It would take far too many people to make it run as deep as as President Clinton said it did. He was drawing on a Crusade Chronicle to make that statement, Fulcher of Chartres, but he was using it very clumsily. You can't take ancient and medieval documents at face value. You have to know the context that they're writing in. You have to know the purpose of what they're saying. And Fulcher was writing something that was very significantly a advertising tract, a PR tract, and a little bit of a boastful statement. Also, drawing on Old Testament imagery. He's very consciously drawing on Old Testament imagery of victories that the Israelites had won over their foes, and saying we're doing the same kind of thing. Yeah. But no, the blood did not run to the horse's bridles or knees or whatever.
Now this is all drawn from the Book of Revelation
it's
as well,
from
which
Revelation
is from
as
the
well.
Old Testament.
Yes.
But the whole point is to show that the struggle, the conflict is between evil and
evil and good. Yes, it's not meant to be taken factually or mathematically.
That's right.
And it's very problematic, as you
but
said.
Even if you concede the point that Clinton is making, and it's polemically self-serving,
yes,
something survives, namely the fact that abuses, atrocities have always been committed. but the principle of abusus non tollit usus, I think, should govern the
Explain what
situation.
you-
And that vindicates it. The abuse doesn't abolish the use.
Correct.
I mean, we committed countless atrocities during World War II
Yes, we
to
did.
rid the world of that scourge called Nazism.
Yes.
But nobody invalidates that crusade in Europe, which is how Eisenhower described it.
Which is a very good parallel, but there's something else that needs to be mentioned in terms of that massacre, and that is the laws of war that applied universally to everyone in the ancient and medieval world, and really up into the modern world. When a city is besieged, if it surrenders, then it can make terms, and the lives, and to a certain degree perhaps the property of the people in the city are spared. If a city decides to resist and take its chances, then if it falls to storm, everything, the people, the belongings in the city belong to the conqueror. Now that may be very unpleasant, and I certainly would not want to be present at such an event on either the conquering or the defeated side, but that is the law.
This was the common law.
This is the
I
law
mean,
of
the
war.
Muslims observed it fastidiously.
Very
and
fastidiously
ruthlessly.
and
I mean,
ruthlessly.
when you look at
Yes.
how the Muslims conquered Christian lands for centuries, building up until 1099 when Jerusalem falls, you know, you see a horrendous record completely whitewashed and forgotten. And I think more to the point
context
is
of
this,
that is missing.
You know, I think we
It is.
project ourselves in our own self-contempt in acting as though this was all, you know, proto-colonialization, you know, that this was our attempt, you know, as the first world to kind of colonize the third world. But as you've pointed out, and as Professor Tom Madden has pointed out, Islam was the first world. You know, the Muslim civilization was the superpower really up until about the 16th century. Europe through the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries was more like a third world. And they were the ones who were being colonized by
Very much.
force, you know, with Asia Minor falling as it did, you know, in the 11th century and so on.
Yes, and we don't have nearly time enough to list all the Muslim massacres of Christian cities, but just to list two or three. Christmas Eve 1144 in Edessa, the Muslims broke into the first Crusader state and massacred they targeted specifically all the Frankish Christians. It was really an act of ethnic cleansing or genocide. Killed them all. 2 years later, when the Armenian Christians there asked for the Crusaders to come back and save them from the Muslims and rule them, the Muslims came back again and killed all the Armenian Christians. In I think it was 68, the Muslims took Antioch from the capital of that northern Crusader state and massacred so many of the Christians there that most of the noble families of Antioch simply disappear from the historical record. They're all dead. 1453, the fall of Constantinople, enormous massacres, rapes of nuns. I mean, this is all part of the laws of war. If you're going to criticize what happened in 1099 in Jerusalem, you need to look at the larger record.
But you also have to look at Dresden in 1944. You know, the firebombing of the city that did more devastation to a civilian population than Nagasaki and Hiroshima put together. You know, for days and for nights, you know, with the calm detachment of a B-24 bomber or whatever. And, you know, I am not pro-Nazi in any sense, but when you look at the abuses and when you recognize the fact that this is more than morally questionable, this is reprehensible.
Morally reprehensible.
Yeah, and the details that you marshal, I think, with great scholarly rigor and scruple, you have to see those against the backdrop of a world that is simply vanishing, a Christian world. It disappears. I mean, two-thirds of Christendom is gone, vaporized in the space of what, a century or two.
In the space of a century.
Most of the Mediterranean world is vacated, and the Muslims simply take over. They swallow it whole. I mean, why wouldn't there be a crusade to try to win this back?
Well, and sometimes people say, well, it took a long time for the Crusaders to respond. It took 450 or so years. It took that long for a crusade to be declared, but it did not take that long for Christians to counterattack. Christians had been counterattacking in other ways. The Byzantines, the Eastern Christians, had been counterattacking repeatedly. And in the 10th century, Byzantine armies got as far into the Holy Land as Nazareth. Their logistic lines got overextended and they couldn't make it any further and had to withdraw. But they were trying. And the Italians and the southern French were trying. The Spanish were beginning their Reconquista in the Spanish Peninsula. So there are plenty of other earlier examples of Christian forces counterattacking. The Crusades
it's
is just another one.
When you contrast, for example, the world of Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries. All of North Africa is Christian. 1,000 years later, none of it is. What happened?
Well, within 1 or 2 centuries, I mean, when you look at what Muhammad did in a short life, you know, he was a teacher, but he was a warrior first and foremost, and a very effective one.
Effective one.
And Muslims are not quiet about that. They're very proud and grateful for his legacy. And so when you compare Jesus and Muhammad and the two religions they found, when Christians just simply kill in the name of Christ, they're often betraying, their founder. But when Muslims follow Muhammad in conquering the Dar al-Jihad, that part of the world that has not submitted to the Dar al-Islam, this is something of imitative behavior. And it's something that is virtuous in their understanding. And we, as uncomfortable as that makes us feel, it's time to grow up. Look at them from their own perspective. And this also helped me understand why, really until the 19th century, Muslims did not think that the Crusaders were these vandals and these, they respected Christian warfare as, an attempt to kind of match.
These were honest adversaries.
Honest adversaries, that's correct.
That's a good way to put it.
And even in the course of the Crusades, the Muslims preferred honest, wholehearted Christian adversaries. On the Sixth Crusade, the German Emperor Frederick II went to negotiate, not fight, and went out of his way to badmouth Christians to his Muslim hosts, and his Muslim hosts were offended. And basically said to him, why don't you be a good Christian and play your own side? Stop
and fight.
Stop being a traitor.
And again, we want to say that this is not to deny the evils that were happening at the time of the Crusades. The slaughter of Jews at times by the Crusaders. Pope Urban II condemned that.
As did Bernard of Clairvaux.
That's right.
That was not an integral part of the Crusades.
No, in fact, it was a violation
of the spirit. There were plenty of violations of the spirit and of the rules for the Crusades, but that, as you said, doesn't invalidate the principle.
And just to go to another myth here, just in our limited amount of time, I mean, it's often brought up, we just talked about some of the atrocities that are often thrown that are really missing context and historically inaccurate. Was there a motivation of, as a lot of people talk about it, as a motivation of greed and wealth and trying to capture all of this? Is that, help put that in some historical context?
No, that's myth.
That's like au contraire.
It's like exactly the opposite.
I could answer that question simply by saying no. Let me tell you an interesting story that I just discovered the other day from the 13th century. There was a French nobleman, Enguerrand de Coucy, who was a jerk, to put it technically. He found some young men trespassing on his property, and he executed them, just for trespassing, basically. The case went to Louis IX, King Louis of France, who was a Crusader king. Louis tried him, found him guilty, and among other things, sentenced him to 3 years crusade.
Is that right?
Which he had to redeem by paying 12,000 livres, which is a huge amount of money. I'm telling you that story to show you that by the middle of the 13th century, crusading was viewed as so difficult and so dangerous and so expensive that it was along the lines of a fine.
Right. So instead of a penitentiary being slapped, put in there, this is a penitential.
Which happened very many times to a lot of people.
So people weren't rushing off to make their money in the crusade.
It became a means of atonement.
It became a means of atonement.
For sin. For
one of the reasons that people think that it was an opportunity to make your fortune is, again, going back to Fulcher of Chartres, to his chronicle. The same one that said that Jerusalem's streets ran so deeply with blood, he also said, come east and become rich and get a large amount of land to rule. That's an advertising brochure, and it's probably not much more accurate than the ones you get for condos in Florida.
Or join the army and see the world.
Pretty much,
And they often had a fund. Reading all of your articles, there's a number of references to them having to fund it, and upwards of 6 years worth of taxes for one of the kingdoms to just fund a crusade.
On the Seventh Crusade for Louis IX. It's very hard to translate medieval money into modern money. But roughly speaking, for a night to go on crusade, it would have cost him about the equivalent of $250,000 today. So they had to do things like
mortgage. This was voluntary.
This was voluntary.
And risky.
The
point
their lives were.
In the first crusade, many of them, most, did not return. And the losses are staggering.
And people
are
knew
very
that,
high.
right?
Yes.
So people.
I think
very
it's 75% as a casualty rate.
It's extremely
pretty high.
It's extremely high.
Unbelievable.
Well, can you explain? I mean, this is the puzzle that I need to have you figure out for us. The widespread caricature, which strikes me as pretty wicked, because the points you make are transparently obvious. Why haven't others cottoned on to it, particularly scholars? I mean, you came out of the University of Wisconsin, which is sort of a hotbed of liberal scholarship. How did you survive that? And the students you teach now, What do they make of these claims?
Well, the answer to your first question is grazie Dei, I think. Crusade historians actually have done a rather good job of dispelling the myths. What we haven't done a good job of is crossing the divide from Crusade history to the public.
PR.
PR.
Yeah,
We've
yeah,
been
yeah,
trying. I talked to one of my friends about this a few years ago and said, how long is it going to take us to get the record straightened out?
Right.
And he said, probably never.
Yeah.
What we need is a Sir Stephen Runciman on our side.
We do.
Because, I mean, that author in the early 50s basically just swept the world like a literary tsunami. I mean,
Right.
everybody was reading him. And when I sat down and read him, I knew these were lies, but man, can he write.
But they're very well told lies.
Oh,
It's very beautiful and very compelling. It's this Oxbridge English. The series needs to be rewritten. It needs to be redone by somebody who understands the historical record of the Crusades and can encapsulate that in the same kind of language.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a challenge.
The glamour,
glamour.
of the lack of history.
Well, he understands how to tell
appreciate
stories and to tell stories very well, but it's easy to do because the Crusades are full of exciting and beautiful
Well, you know,
stories.
the anti-Christian approach that you find in Voltaire and then raised by Gibbon and Sir Walter Scott, you know, was a minority report. Now it's beyond a majority report.
It's
almost
consensus.
it's in the water supply and in the air we breathe. When I went to the Holy Land, it's the only thing you hear
that's right.
from Christians as well on the pilgrimage.
Well, there was a group of Protestants in 1999 that went on an apology walk, a reconciliation walk, and apologized for the Crusades to every Muslim that they met, which must have struck the local Christians in the area as a little odd.
Ludicrous. There's something grotesque about that.
In a very short few moments here, can you speak to the myth surrounding indulgences being offered for killing Muslims? Was that accurate?
No.
Okay, that's your short answer.
No, there's no indulgence being given for killing Muslims.
Because that is definitely something, again, perpetuated as part of myth and legend.
Bernard of Clairvaux said in his In Praise of the New Knighthood that it was a good and virtuous act to kill Muslims, is what he meant, if you had to do it. But it would be better, he said, and he was very careful to say this, it would be better if we didn't have to do it. We only do this when we have to do it.
Yeah, distinctions like that don't make the headlines.
No, they don't. But he, it's not even a minor distinction. He was very clear about it.
Stay with us on Franciscan University Presents.
My name is Kelly Butler, and I'm a communication arts major. I took independent digital filmmaking. Definitely intense. Many all-nighters in the editing lab getting things done. Pope John Paul II has a quote, "Do not be afraid to go out into the streets and into public places to preach Christ like the first apostles." That's what we're called to as Catholics and as Christians. You have that responsibility that every work you create should reflect Christ. Franciscan University is academically excellent and passionately Catholic.
Explore the treasures of your Catholic heritage on a Franciscan University pilgrimage. Led by inspiring spiritual directors, you'll walk in the footsteps of saints and martyrs in the Holy Land, Poland, France, and Italy, and you'll deepen your love for Jesus Christ through daily Mass, confession, prayer, and the joy of Christian fellowship. Let Franciscan University lead you on a pilgrimage of faith. Find out more at franciscan.edu/pilgrimages.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. This entire program springs forth from the very heart of Franciscan University. It's being taped right now in our communication arts studio. Our students are operating the cameras and equipment. Our panelists, as well as myself, are here at Franciscan University. Dr. Crawford, we've been talking about the Crusades, and I really appreciate you unpacking some of the myths. You mentioned something as we kind of closed out about this apology walk, and I and others may have thought Pope John Paul actually apologized for the Crusades. Could you help set the record straight?
Sure. He didn't.
I like your very short answers.
Well, there's short ones and then there's unpacked ones. He did not apologize for the Crusades. He apologized for things that Catholics might have done that were wrong in the course of the Crusades, which is a very different proposition.
And it wasn't hypothetical. He didn't say might have done. He acknowledged that there were many
but there were things
that
that were done
that were wrong.
Right. And there were.
You know, the Crusades themselves were not the thing that he apologized for.
They were not.
The abuses. You know.
Yes.
Right.
No, did not and really could not, because the Crusades were designed and supported and promulgated by centuries and centuries of his predecessors as an activity of the Church stemming really from the magisterium.
Wow.
So you really cannot, as a Catholic, say that the Crusades were unjustified. You can say that this or that action in the Crusades was unjustified, and that's fine, and I could pick some out and tell you about them.
Right.
Although there are probably fewer than most people think. But you cannot say that crusading as an activity is unjustified. The Church has already spoken on that.
And also a disproportionate ratio of Muslim violence to Christian.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
When I was in the Holy Land, repeatedly, but earlier this year, it's one of those things where I go with my wife and I have to brace myself because invariably, she will speak up in defense of the Byzantine, and of the Crusaders. And I just watch and wait for the blowback because from our own fellow Catholic pilgrims, there's this backlash. This was evil, this was diabolical, this was satanic, and then we have to kind of sift and sort and indicate that no, this has got to be something that we revisit because as a matter of historical fact, there are a lot of misunderstandings.
Yes, there are.
Yeah.
Very.
And I think that's crucial because that's why we're here. Is that there is so much fact
I
and
think
fiction mixed
in
together.
reconstructing an accurate historical record, it helps, I think, to invoke this theme of love, of charity, which is, I think, at the heart of the crusading enterprise. It's animated by love. I mean, it's a defense of Christendom, which is not a juridical theory. It's an act of love.
It's an act of
you want to give to the other that which you most esteem, Jesus Christ. And if he's already assimilated himself to Christ, then he needs to be protected, preserved. And if Muslims are bent on subjugating him to an alien creed, then good men ought to intervene to protect him.
Yes, and you said something important and interesting there. That is that we need to go back and look at what they thought of what they were doing.
That's right.
And you need to do it carefully because it's easy to take a modern mentality back to medieval sources and say, oh, I know what they're talking about, as in the case with full Sheriff Shart. He said the blood ran this deep, so he must have meant it. No, he didn't mean it. Historians need to be careful and respectful, and they need to approach primary sources, the sources of the time, with humility and listen to what those people are saying about themselves. Why did they do it? What did they think they were doing? Why did they think they had to do it? And if you read Crusade history sources with that level of humility and that ability to listen to what they have to say, you will come up with a very different idea about what the Crusades were than what you find in U.S. News and Time and
Yeah,
Newsweek.
and that's what I would love for you to just unpack that a little bit, of what was in the mind of the average person in medieval Christendom, if you will, and in light of the Crusades. What did they think? I mean, not the PR version, if you will, but what was really in the mind of those? How did they view the Crusades?
Well, first of all, once again, to keep repeating this, they viewed it as an act of love. They also viewed it very significantly, and we forget this in the modern world, but they very significantly viewed it as an act of penance. Crusading and penance, as in penance after confession, was a very significant element of the Crusades. It was unpleasant, it was expensive, it was dangerous, it was likely to result in your death. It was an extension of pilgrimage per se as being an act of penance. This is an armed pilgrimage that is even more dangerous and difficult than an ordinary pilgrimage, and it's a way to expiate the temporal penalties for your sins.
Yeah, it's a huge sacrifice. When you consider Chaucer's account of the pilgrimage to Canterbury,
yes.
I mean, those pilgrims knew they'd come back.
Yes.
But if you go to Jerusalem to liberate the holy places, the likelihood is you'll never come back.
On the First Crusade, it may have been as many as 3/4 of the participants who didn't come back.
There's a disconnect here that I think can be overcome, at least in part, by an analogy, because I think many of us have read Tom Brokaw's The Greatest Generation. And you can see through the eyes of men, just like my dad, what it was like to fight and to sacrifice and to go overseas, either the Pacific theater or the European theater, and how many lives were lost, but how much more than just life was lost. I mean, it was a tremendous sort of secular penance.
Yes.
And you can look at it cynically after the fact and say, no, it was just an attempt to kind of spread things, American. And we celebrate Veterans Day, we celebrate Memorial Day, and rightly, because we recognize the virtue of patriotism and the sacrifices, But when you fight world wars to make the world safe for democracy and economic freedom, that's one thing. But if you're going to fight to make the world safe for religious freedom and the Christian faith, so that Christian families that have been conquered and captured and enslaved and forcibly converted, it seems to me that is not a lower priority.
Right. No,
from an eternal perspective, it's a higher priority.
And that is a good definition of what the Crusades were about.
Right. Yeah. Well, in your elaboration of this myth, a four-part myth, One of the charges that is typically made is that these guys were governed by cynicism. They didn't believe the propaganda.
That's not
It was
true.
all claptrap.
Yeah.
They were driven by a lust for conquest and money and a kind of weird piety. But all of that is balderdash. They were driven by this desire to liberate something sacred, something precious, and they were prepared to make a supreme sacrifice of self, their
Yes,
own blood.
They were. I'm working on a biography of a crusade leader, Renaud of Châtillon, who was murdered by Saladin after the Battle of Hattin in 1187. And his grandfather, I believe it was the Lord of Danzy and the Count of Chalon in northern France. The county of Chalon was a significant principality, a county rather. His grandfather sold that county in order to raise the money to go on crusade, so he pretty much permanently alienated it from the family, which is something that medieval nobles didn't like to do.
Right.
But he did it in order to get the money to go on. It was a second part of the first.
You know,
crusade.
Aristotle teaches that property is really an extension of the self.
And he
So
was
to
giving up.
divest yourself of your property,
Yeah.
that's an enormous depletion.
Yes, and they did it habitually and commonly. You had to do that to go on crusade, and everybody knew it.
So when we commit this blackguardism about our ancestors, that's a kind of historical libel. We
It is.
slander the dead.
is.
We dishonor them. We don't take seriously the motives that they pretty plainly set out.
For anybody who is serious about being able to practice his or her faith freely and openly and to the extent that you want to be able to do it, for anyone who has that orientation, to be negative about the Crusades is an act of ingratitude, I'm afraid.
And it's our family history.
And ignorance.
And ignorance.
Ignorance and
Yeah.
ingratitude, yes.
And because it is our family history. It's
Yes.
part of our lineage. It's
Yes.
part of our understanding. Whether or not we have direct descendants who were in the Crusades or not, it's part of our corporate history.
Yeah.
And we need to understand that, and we need to make sure we defend against fact from fiction. But you've alluded a little to this, and we've talked about kind of how this broke down, and we have this clear understanding of what should be understood. But the historians haven't approached it. Popularists haven't approached it with the humility you called for, and that's probably where it started breaking down in our current understanding. The cultural understanding today was really broken down. Is that an accurate way to say that whether it be from the Reformation or other popular works, where did this idea, this true understanding, historically accurate understanding, really start breaking down? When did that fall apart, really?
Well, as Scott mentioned earlier, the Reformation is a significant moment when it breaks down. Luther, I think, at one point said, or is said to have said, he'd rather have the Turk than the Pope.
Is that right?
I'm not sure he meant it, but he said some extreme things.
Which some Byzantines said too.
And Byzantines also said it sometimes, yes. So it's partly from the Reformation, partly from, on the part of some, not all, Byzantines' distaste for the Pope. It comes from the Enlightenment. Certainly Voltaire told a lot of lies, I'm afraid, about the Crusades and about other aspects of Christianity. Voltaire preferred Islam.
What
as a
time frame
government.
is that?
This is the 18th century.
Okay.
Voltaire is the earlier 18th century, and he preferred Islam as a government religion to Christianity. He was quite clear about it. But you also get it at the end of the 19th century. In the 19th century, there were Europeans who were pro-imperialism, and they tended to glorify the Crusades, seeing them as imperialistic activities. They were wrong. They weren't imperialistic, but they were positive about them because of their misunderstanding. Any European who was anti-imperialistic was negative about the Crusades, again from a mistaken idea. And then when you get Marxism and people like Lenin who were so anti-imperialistic, they looked at the 19th century's understanding of crusading as imperialistic and rejected it. But it's again from a misunderstanding of what crusading is about. It's never imperialistic.
Right. The figure of Voltaire, I think, is fascinating because he represents a kind of symbol.
Yes.
He's a cynic, really.
Very
and a
much so,
parasite.
yes.
I mean, it's the confiscation of the spiritual riches of Christianity by men who no longer believe in Christianity. So they feed off what they regard as a corpse, and yet it's life-giving. And I resent that. I mean, somebody needs to go back and exhume Voltaire and try him
and
for
also
these crimes.
And recognize what an emblematic figure he is, because his name is now Legion, for there are so many intellectual parasites who advance their own agendas based upon the capital, the little residual capital that is
which
left
we're
of
spending.
Christendom. Yeah. I want to also mention that, you know, we had the luxury of having a lunch out at Bob Evans months ago.
A very pleasant one.
Yeah, and look forward to more of those. But you pointed out to me back then the works of, you know, Jonathan Riley Smith. What were the Crusades, and more recently the Crusades, Christianity and Islam, a British historian, as well as an American historian, Thomas F. Madden, as well as the works of Dr. Paul Crawford. You know, these sorts of things are accessible.
Yes.
They're understandable. I mean, there's scholars who write a lot of scholarly articles that you have to be an academic to really appreciate, but they're also breaking it down so that ordinary people who are highly motivated can get this and give it to other people as well. You know, when I became a Catholic, you know, Mary, the Pope, purgatory, the saints, all of the usual issues, suspects, you know. But I mean, the Crusades, I mean, that's the one thing that Protestants and Catholics agreed on. These were reprehensible and horrible things, you know. So this was like a citadel off in the distance, you know, ruins, you know. I don't even need to go there. And when I went there, I'm like, oh my goodness, yet one more has to fall.
Too many put those up as obstacles. I mean, what's the impact of this, do you think? I mean, this is taking you maybe out of your expertise, but looking forward today, at our appreciation, we have presidents who are quoting some inaccurate things. What does that really mean in our relations and our understanding kind of going forward? You know, I mean, there seems to be so much with our understanding of Islam, so much with the turmoil in the Middle East. I mean, I think there's just so much there that this really influences us.
I think it has to do with our ability and willingness to defend ourselves and to defend our faith. And if we don't rediscover that, those who are not willing to defend themselves and their faith and their way of life are going to be run over by people who believe more strongly than they do. And the Islamic world, to do them credit, is generally not deficient in that respect.
But the crucial piece in the puzzle is that you're willing to defend what you regard as defensible.
As truth.
And more people don't see Christianity as defensible.
And you're willing to also desire that which we don't have, and that is, you know, the modicum of a Christian social order. I mean, it's one of those things where even solid Christians I know don't desire a Christian social order. They want simply the right to kind of privatize it for themselves, and okay, my family and my parish, but you know, just give us a sort of Indian reservation, as it were, you know.
That's right.
And it seems to me that something much greater is needed, and that is the social vision that our faith is inherently corporate. It's public.
Public and corporate, yes.
I think of Jeremiah, the prophet. One Old Testament scholar said that what bothered Jeremiah so much was not that his fellow Jews were in exile, but that they didn't know it. That they were so Babylonianized that they weren't even aware that there was a city, Jerusalem, and a temple in ruins.
Yes, and this is a problem with the dhimmi status. Over centuries, it can crush communities into a sort of Stockholm syndrome, a sort of
So they were always oppressed and they felt comfortable, and then
Good analogy.
or at least were uncomfortable objecting to it. And I think that's true for many dhimmi communities today. They don't dare object to it and have learned not to dare.
And they don't want people coming in to object to it either, because that's going to make it really bad for us when you leave.
Yes.
Stay with us for the last segment on Franciscan University Presents.
My name is Joseph Krelich. I'm a chemistry major, biology minor here at Franciscan University. I love the atmosphere, just completely centered around the Catholic faith. When I play soccer, when I'm in classes, everything has that same Catholic attitude. Myself and a few other chemistry majors have the opportunity to work with top scientists in order to combat neglected diseases. I was able to connect my love for chemistry and also my love for mission work by synthesizing chemical compounds. Franciscan University is academically excellent and passionately Catholic.
Study online, on campus, or both in graduate programs for working adults at Franciscan University of Steubenville. Advance your career with the ethical approach to management you'll find in our MBA. Bring online learning to life through our Masters in Education. Prepare for advanced practice nursing with our Masters in Nursing. Check franciscan.edu or call 800-783-6220.
Welcome back to Franciscan University Presents. We've been talking to Dr. Paul Crawford, professor and author, about the Crusades. This is our final segment, Regis, so could you start off our kind of summations?
Oh gosh, there's a great many things that I'd like to say, but and not the least of them is a gesture of gratitude and thanksgiving to you for having come. You exhibit a learned enthusiasm, which I find infectious. I'd love to have been one of your students. Of course, I'd be much older than you, but I would find your material highly contagious. And I'm struck by that word gratitude, because in the break before this final session, you mentioned, and it's haunted me, this image of going home to God and being sort of accosted by your ancestors who want to know, what did you do to advance the cause of Christendom? And you know, if your hands are empty, maybe you didn't do anything, but at least in the classroom, you can give witness to the truth. And the truth, in the end, I think, will vindicate you before the councils of eternal judgment. Another point, Chesterton speaks of the democracy of the dead, that we ought to give votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors in the faith. We owe them something, some deference. And I think by telling the truth about what they did, that I think is the tribute we pay to their memory, and we keep it alive. And one particular memory I have, which came to mind in the course of preparing for this show, was something my great friend and mentor, Fritz Wilhelmsen, did. He was an assistant professor at the University of Santa Clara in California in the mid-1950s, when the Budapest uprising took place. And he spoke to the student body and galvanized about 1,400 of them to sign on as crusaders to go to Hungary to help their brothers lift this yoke of Soviet tyranny. Of course, he was refused by the State Department. We don't need you. And the Eisenhower administration wasn't going to do a damn thing to help Hungary. But for Fritz, that was a kind of flashpoint. It indicated that America was not really interested in liberating these captive peoples. And that's very different from the attitude that motivated our Christian forebears. They were determined to do something, and by God, they succeeded in some modest yet measurable way to make life more hospitable to Christians in the places where, after all, their faith had been founded.
Thank you, Regis. Scott?
You know, I'm reminded of the homilist who gets up to give a homily on ignorance and apathy. And he says, the two biggest problems in the parish are what? And the fellow in the front row leans over, I don't know and I don't care. I would add a third one, and that is ingratitude. You know, I do think the ingratitude is great. I hope and pray that the ignorance is far greater, and I suspect that it is. But debunking this myth, I think, is really become something big, and not just for me, but for all people who are on the side of truth. You know, and not just historical truth, but I mean contemporary circumstances. Historical truth is important in itself to clarify the record and to get it right, and to go back and to recognize these are wars of defense, that these are just wars, these are justifiable wars. Abuses were committed, you know, and all of that, but not quite like what we did, you know, at Dresden and other things too. And yet we celebrate our veterans rightly. At the same time, we acknowledge some excesses. But, you know, Samuel Huntington speaks of the bloody borders of Islam, and how the vast majority of all of the major conflicts that still go on are, you know, in Islamic countries. And it's not a coincidence. It's a fact of history, and it's a moral reality that we have to face, you know. And when we do the historical work, I think we pull back the ivy, and we suddenly are looking at, what is this? It's the front door into a Christian Catholic way of understanding social order and, you know, Western history. And it's not coming too soon, you know. This rediscovery, I think, is going to reawaken in us a desire to go back and get history right, but also to get the present and the future right as well, and to recognize that there is a time and a place to fight, and, you know, there is a time and a place for gratitude as well. Your work, and I know Mike is going to mention this is available on Faith and Reason, that article on the 4 myths is indispensable reading. But what you've recommended in the works of Jonathan Riley Smith, especially this book, The Crusades, Christianity and Islam, I gave it to my 19-year-old and he devoured it, you know, and my kids are all reading it. And so thank you. Keep up the great work, and let's just share the load.
Thank you, Scott. Paul?
Well, I think that we've covered most of the major points already. It's important to think of the Crusades as defensive activities. They are not offensive. They were never supposed to be offensive. They were never supposed to be about conversion. They were the first great Western counterattack against Islam. They weren't the first counterattack against Islam, as we mentioned earlier in the show. The Byzantines had fought back, the Italians had fought back, the Spanish had fought back. But these were the first great Western counterattacks against Islamic aggression, and the first one that was centrally directed by the Pope. For anyone who believes that human beings of whatever faith or ethnic background or whatever have a right to defend themselves against aggression, if that's what you believe, and most people do when pressed, then I don't see how you can condemn the principle of the Crusades. You can condemn this or that thing that happened in the course of them, but you can't condemn the principle because they were an act of self-defense and an act of love, as we've also said, on behalf of the Crusaders for those that they were trying to defend. The Crusades, we mentioned something earlier in the show that we didn't get time to follow up on. There was really only one truly successful crusade, and that was the first one. The Third Crusade was also partially successful. The rest of them are pretty much failures. And as a venture considered as a whole, given its own aims of recovering the Holy Land and protecting Eastern Christians, the Crusades really have to be considered a failure, because in the end, Catholic Christians lost the Holy Land and were driven out of the territories that they had tried to defend. But they also need to be considered as a success in the sense that by creating a counterattack, by driving Islam back for a little while, they managed to buy Western Europe, Christian Catholic Europe, time to grow up. So that by the time the Crusades had pretty definitively failed by the 15th century, Western Europe was strong enough to defend itself and to preserve its own Christian way of life. Temporary success, but they did give Western Europe time to survive. And I think, Regis, you brought up something that is very important that we were talking about during the break. As modern people, we need to look back